The morning mist hung low over the abandoned gas station on Route 66, somewhere between Flagstaff and the edge of nowhere. Marcus Cole opened his eyes slowly, his back aching from another night spent on the cold concrete floor of what used to be a service bay. The smell of old motor oil and desert dust filled his nostrils as he stretched his tired limbs, the worn leather of his jacket creaking with every movement. At 47 years old, Marcus had seen better days. His gray-streaked beard was longer than he preferred, and his dark eyes carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. But when he looked at his motorcycle, a 1985 Harley-Davidson Softail that had been his constant companion for the last 20 years, he felt something close to peace. That bike was all he had left in this world. It was more than transportation. It was a witness to his entire life, from the highs of his military service to the lows of losing everything he once held dear. He pushed himself up from the makeshift bed of cardboard boxes and old blankets, his joints protesting with every movement. The Arizona sun was already climbing, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world that had been so cruel. Marcus walked toward the open bay door, ready to greet another day of wandering, of searching for work, of trying to piece together whatever remained of his dignity. That was when he saw her. A woman was crouched beside his motorcycle, her hands working on something near the engine. She wore designer jeans that probably cost more than everything Marcus owned combined, and a white silk blouse that had no business being anywhere near the dusty desert roads. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and even from this distance, Marcus could see the concentration etched on her features. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming. In what universe would a woman like that be touching his bike? His first instinct was defensive, protective. That Harley was his lifeline, his home, his last connection to the man he used to be. Marcus stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. The woman heard him and looked up, and their eyes met across the dusty space. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal, with high cheekbones and green eyes that held a curious mixture of determination and vulnerability. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on a rag that she pulled from her back pocket. There was grease on her fingers, actual motorcycle grease, and Marcus noticed that she had been working on his carburetor with tools that definitely did not belong to a roadside emergency kit. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something floral, probably her perfume. It had been so long since Marcus had been close to anyone who smelled like something other than survival. She spoke first. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being listened to. She told him she noticed his bike had a fuel delivery problem when she drove by earlier that morning. She said she could not just leave it like that, not when she knew how to fix it. Marcus did not know what to say. Nobody had done anything kind for him in longer than he could remember. The world had turned its back on him years ago, and he had grown accustomed to the isolation, the suspicion, the way people looked through him as if he were invisible. He asked her who she was. She smiled, and there was something in that smile that Marcus could not quite decipher. She said her name was Catherine Pierce, and she owned a ranch about 30 miles east of there. She was on her way to Phoenix for a business meeting when she spotted his bike parked outside the abandoned station. Something about it caught her attention, she said. Something that made her turn around and come back. Marcus looked at his motorcycle, then back at the woman who had apparently spent her morning fixing it, instead of attending to whatever important business awaited her in the city. None of it made sense. Women like Catherine Pierce did not stop for homeless bikers on forgotten stretches of highway. They did not kneel in the dust and work on carburetors with their manicured hands. He told her he could not pay her for the work. His voice came out rougher than he intended, carrying the defensive edge that had become his default setting. Catherine did not seem offended. She simply nodded and said she did not do it for payment. She did it because the bike deserved to run properly, and because she had the skills to make that happen. Then she tilted her head slightly, studying him with those penetrating green eyes, and asked if he had eaten anything that morning. Marcus had not. He had not eaten anything substantial in nearly 2 days. The last of his money had gone to gas, and the odd jobs he usually picked up in small towns had been scarce lately. But pride was a stubborn thing, and it kept his jaw clenched against the admission of need. Catherine seemed to read the answer in his silence. She walked to her vehicle, a luxury SUV that gleamed black against the desert backdrop, and returned with a paper bag and a thermos. She set them on the ground near his bike without ceremony, without the condescending pity that he had learned to expect from those rare moments when people noticed his existence. "Breakfast," she said simply, "and coffee." She made it strong because she figured anyone who rode a bike like that probably preferred it that way. Marcus stood frozen, caught between hunger and the instinct to refuse charity. The smell of fresh coffee drifted up from the thermos, and his stomach betrayed him with an audible rumble that broke the tension of the moment. Catherine laughed softly, a genuine sound that carried no mockery. She told him there was no shame in accepting a meal from someone who wanted to give it. Then she surprised him further by sitting down on an old wooden crate near the bay door, as if she had all the time in the world and nowhere more important to be. She asked him about the bike while he ate. Her questions were specific, technical, revealing a depth of knowledge that seemed incongruous with her polished appearance. She wanted to know if he had restored it himself, what year the engine was, whether he had considered upgrading the ignition system. Marcus found himself answering despite his better judgment. There was something about the way she listened, really listened, that made him want to talk. He told her about buying the Harley when he came back from overseas, about the years of careful maintenance, about the modifications he had made with his own hands in better times. The breakfast was simple, but satisfying. Fresh bread, cheese, some kind of expensive jam that tasted like nothing Marcus had experienced in years. The coffee was exactly as strong as she had promised, and it warmed him from the inside out as he sat across from this mysterious woman who had wandered into his life like a character from a dream. When he finished eating, Catherine stood and brushed the dust from her jeans. She pulled a business card from her pocket and held it out to him. Her ranch was called Copper Canyon, she said. If he ever found himself in the area and needed work, he should stop by. She could always use someone who understood engines. Marcus took the card, turning it over in his calloused fingers. The paper was thick and expensive, embossed with elegant lettering. It felt strange in his hands, like a passport to a world he no longer belonged to. He asked her why. Why would she stop for a stranger, fix his bike, feed him breakfast, offer him employment? What was in it for her? Catherine was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant, looking at something Marcus could not see. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, carrying an undertone of emotion that had not been there before. She told him that everyone deserves a second chance. She said she believed that people ended up where they were supposed to be, meeting who they were supposed to meet. She said she had learned that lesson the hard way, and she tried to live by it every single day. Then she walked back to her SUV, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Marcus watched until the vehicle disappeared over the horizon, leaving nothing but a trail of dust and questions that hung in the air like morning fog. He stood there for a long time, holding the business card in one hand and feeling something shift in his chest. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. A crack in the armor he had built around himself over all these years of solitude and disappointment. Marcus did not believe in fate or destiny or any of that mystical nonsense. He believed in cause and effect, in the cold mathematics of survival. But something about Catherine Pierce and her inexplicable kindness had unsettled him in ways he could not quite articulate. He walked back to his motorcycle and examined the work she had done. It was professional, meticulous, the kind of repair that showed genuine expertise. Whoever this woman was, she knew her way around an engine. That alone made her unlike anyone Marcus had met in his years on the road. The Harley started on the first try, purring with a smoothness that had been missing for weeks. Marcus sat astride the bike, feeling the familiar vibration beneath him, and made a decision that surprised even himself. He would go to Copper Canyon, not because he believed Catherine's offer was genuine, and not because he thought anything good would come of it. He would go because curiosity was the last luxury he could afford, and because something in her voice had sounded like truth. The desert stretched before him, vast and indifferent, as he pulled out of the abandoned gas station and headed east. The wind whipped against his face, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Cole allowed himself to wonder what might happen next. The road to Copper Canyon wound through landscapes that seemed to shift with every mile. Red rock formations gave way to rolling hills covered in scrub brush, which eventually opened into a valley so green it seemed like a mirage against the surrounding desert. Water was rare in this part of Arizona, but someone had invested heavily in making this land bloom. Marcus spotted the ranch before he reached the main gate. It sprawled across the valley floor like something out of a Western film, all whitewashed fences and adobe buildings with terracotta roofs. Horses grazed in distant pastures, and he could see workers moving between the outbuildings with the purposeful stride of people who had important tasks to complete. The main gate was open, flanked by stone pillars engraved with the Copper Canyon name. Marcus hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look. His clothes were worn, his beard unkempt, his entire appearance a testament to the hard years he had survived. This ranch belonged to a different world, one where people had clean shirts and regular meals and futures worth planning for. But he had come this far, and turning back now felt like admitting defeat to something he could not quite name. Marcus guided his motorcycle down the long driveway, past fenced paddocks and hay barns, until he reached a circular drive in front of the main house. It was magnificent. 3 stories of Southwest architecture, with wide windows that caught the afternoon sun, and a wraparound porch that seemed to invite visitors to sit and stay a while. Flower boxes overflowed with blooms that should not have thrived in the desert heat, and the lawn was the deep green of careful irrigation. Marcus parked his bike and removed his helmet, running his fingers through his sweat-dampened hair. He felt exposed without the protection of the road, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. This place represented everything he had lost, everything he had given up on ever having again. Before he could decide whether to knock on the door or simply ride away, a voice called out from the side of the house. It was a man's voice, deep and friendly, belonging to someone who had clearly spent most of his life outdoors. The man who appeared was in his 60s, with the weathered face and strong hands of a lifetime rancher. He wore work clothes and a straw hat, and his smile was genuine as he approached Marcus with the easy gait of someone who had nothing to prove. He introduced himself as Henry, the ranch foreman. He said Catherine had told him a biker might be coming by, someone who knew engines. He said he was glad to see Marcus had decided to take her up on her offer. Marcus did not know what to make of this reception. He had expected suspicion, perhaps hostility, the kind of treatment homeless wanderers usually received when they showed up at wealthy properties. Instead, Henry was extending his hand like they were old friends reuniting after a long separation. They shook hands, and Marcus noted the calluses on Henry's palm, the grip of a man who had done real work every day of his life. There was no judgment in the foreman's eyes, just an open curiosity and what seemed like genuine welcome. Henry explained that the ranch had a fleet of vehicles and equipment that needed constant maintenance. They had a mechanic on staff, but he was getting older and could use the help. More importantly, Catherine had made it clear that Marcus should be given a chance, and Henry trusted her judgment implicitly. Marcus asked how long Catherine had owned the ranch. Henry's expression shifted slightly, taking on a quality of careful consideration. He said Catherine had inherited Copper Canyon from her father 5 years ago. She had grown up here, left to build her own career in the city, and returned when the old man passed away. She ran the operation now, every aspect of it, with a dedication that Henry said bordered on obsession. There was something in the way Henry spoke about Catherine that suggested deeper waters beneath the surface, stories that were not his to tell. Marcus filed that observation away, adding it to the growing collection of questions he had about this woman who had appeared in his life without warning. Henry offered to show Marcus around, introduce him to the other workers, get him settled in the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. The work would start tomorrow, he said, but first Marcus needed to rest and eat and remember what it felt like to be somewhere that might become home. That word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Home. He had not had one of those in so long that the concept had become abstract, a memory of warmth that belonged to another version of himself. To hear someone use it casually, as if it were something Marcus could simply claim, stirred emotions he had worked hard to bury. The bunkhouse was simple but clean, with individual rooms for each worker and shared facilities that were well maintained. Henry showed Marcus to a room at the end of the hall, apologizing for the size, even though it was larger and more comfortable than anywhere Marcus had slept in years. There was a bed with fresh sheets, a small desk and chair, a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. Someone had placed towels on the bed, along with toiletries and a change of clothes that looked approximately the right size. These small gestures of care were almost overwhelming in their normalcy. Henry left Marcus alone to settle in, promising that dinner would be served in the main mess hall at 7. As the foreman's footsteps faded down the hallway, Marcus stood in the center of his new room and tried to process everything that had happened since that morning. 24 hours ago, he had been sleeping on concrete in an abandoned gas station, wondering where his next meal would come from. Now he was standing in a private room on a beautiful ranch, with the promise of work and food and the kind of stability that had seemed impossible. He did not trust it. Life had taught him that good things were temporary, that kindness often came with hidden costs, that hope was just disappointment waiting to happen. But he was too tired to run, and too curious to leave without understanding why Catherine Pierce had chosen to upend his world. Marcus took a long shower, the first hot water he had experienced in weeks. He stood under the spray until his skin turned pink, watching the accumulated grime of the road swirl down the drain. It felt like more than just physical cleansing, like he was washing away some of the armor he had built up over years of hardship. When he looked in the mirror afterward, he barely recognized the face staring back at him. The beard was still too long, the eyes still too wary, but there was something different in his expression. Something that might have been hope, or maybe just the absence of complete despair. He dressed in the clean clothes that had been provided, simple jeans and a flannel shirt that fit surprisingly well. Someone had paid attention to his size, another small detail that spoke to a level of care that Marcus found deeply unsettling in its unexpectedness. Dinner in the mess hall was a revelation. The food was hearty and plentiful, prepared by a cook who clearly took pride in feeding the ranch workers well. Marcus sat at a long table with a dozen other men and women, all of whom introduced themselves with varying degrees of warmth and curiosity. They were ranch hands and farm workers, mechanics and groundskeepers, people from all walks of life who had found their way to Copper Canyon for reasons of their own. Nobody asked Marcus about his past or judged him for his appearance. They simply welcomed him as the newest member of their community and passed him the potatoes. It was surreal, sitting in that warm room with food on his plate and conversation flowing around him. Marcus had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something, to belong to a group of people who expected him to show up and contribute. The isolation of his years on the road had been so complete that even this simple meal felt like a kind of miracle. After dinner, Marcus walked outside to clear his head. The desert night had descended, cool and clear, with more stars visible than he had seen in years. He found a quiet spot near the horse barn and stood there, looking up at the sky, trying to make sense of his new reality. That was when Catherine found him. She approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the gravel path, and stood beside him without speaking. They looked at the stars together for a long moment, two strangers sharing a silence that felt oddly comfortable. She spoke first, asking if he had settled in all right. Her voice was different here on her home ground, more relaxed, but also more vulnerable. The confident woman who had fixed his motorcycle seemed to have been replaced by someone more uncertain, more human. Marcus told her the room was fine, better than anything he had expected. He thanked her for the opportunity, though the words felt inadequate for what she had done. Catherine nodded, still looking at the sky. She said she had watched him ride in earlier, from the window of her office. She said there was something in the way he sat on that motorcycle that told her she had made the right decision by offering him work. Marcus asked what that something was. She turned to face him, her features softened by starlight. She said he rode like someone who understood that the machine was not just transportation, but a partner. She said she could tell he cared for that bike the way other people cared for living things. That kind of respect, she said, was rare and valuable. There was more to it than that, Marcus knew. People did not upend their schedules and invite strangers into their lives because of how they rode motorcycles. But Catherine was not offering any additional explanation, and he did not feel entitled to push for one. Instead, he asked about the ranch. How had a woman who seemed so comfortable in silk blouses and luxury vehicles ended up running a working cattle operation in the middle of the Arizona desert? Catherine's laugh was quiet, almost sad. She said that was a long story, the kind that required more than one evening to tell properly. But the short version was that she had been born here, raised here, and had spent most of her adult life running away from here. When her father died, she realized that running was not the same as escaping, and that some places held you no matter how far you traveled. Marcus understood that sentiment better than he wanted to admit. His own past was full of places and people he had tried to outrun, ghosts that followed him regardless of how many miles he put on his odometer. He asked if she regretted coming back. Catherine considered the question carefully before answering. She said she regretted a lot of things in her life, decisions she had made, and opportunities she had wasted. But returning to Copper Canyon was not among them. This land had healed her in ways she had not known she needed healing, and the work had given her purpose when she thought she had none left. Her words resonated with something deep in Marcus's chest. He had not come here looking for healing or purpose, but standing under these stars with this mysterious woman, he could feel the possibility of both hovering at the edge of his awareness. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this remind us that hope can find us in the most unexpected places, and you never know when a single moment of kindness might change everything. Subscribe now so you do not miss what happens next in this incredible journey. They talked for another hour, sharing fragments of their lives without revealing too much. Catherine told Marcus about her years in the corporate world, building a career in real estate development that had made her wealthy but hollow. Marcus told her about his military service, about the brothers he had lost overseas, and the piece of himself that had never fully returned from the desert. It was easier to talk in the darkness, easier to be honest when they could not fully see each other's faces. By the time they parted ways, Marcus felt like he had known Catherine Pierce for years rather than hours. There was a connection between them, unspoken but undeniable, that neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge directly. He returned to his room and lay on the soft bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of ranch life settling into sleep. Tomorrow would bring work and expectations and the continued navigation of this strange new situation. But for tonight, Marcus allowed himself to simply exist in the comfort of clean sheets and a full stomach, and the distant possibility that his life might be changing. Sleep came easier than it had in years, deep and dreamless, as if his body recognized that it was finally safe enough to truly rest. The first weeks at Copper Canyon passed in a blur of work and adaptation. Marcus threw himself into the job with an intensity that surprised even himself, spending long hours in the ranch's equipment barn, diagnosing problems and performing repairs that had been neglected for months. The staff mechanic, an older man named Javier, was initially suspicious of the newcomer but quickly came to appreciate Marcus's skills. They worked side by side, exchanging knowledge with the easy camaraderie of men who communicated best through shared labor. Javier had decades of experience with agricultural equipment, while Marcus brought a military precision and motorcycle expertise that complemented the older man's knowledge perfectly. Henry kept a watchful eye on Marcus during those early days, but whatever he saw seemed to satisfy his concerns. The foreman began trusting Marcus with increasingly complex tasks, eventually giving him responsibility for maintaining the ranch's fleet of trucks and ATVs in addition to the tractors and harvesters. The physical work was demanding, but satisfying. Marcus's hands grew calloused again, familiar calluses returning to familiar places, and his body remembered what it felt like to be useful. The ranch provided 3 meals a day, and he began to regain the weight he had lost during his years of wandering. His reflection in the mirror started to resemble someone he recognized, someone he had been before everything fell apart. He saw Catherine regularly, but unpredictably. She appeared at the equipment barn sometimes, ostensibly to check on repairs but lingering to watch Marcus work. She joined the staff for meals occasionally, sitting at the long table like any other ranch hand rather than the woman who owned everything around them. Each encounter was brief but charged with an energy that Marcus could not quite identify. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after his arrival, Catherine asked Marcus to look at her personal vehicle. The luxury SUV that she had driven to that abandoned gas station was making a strange noise, she said, something that her usual mechanic in Phoenix had been unable to diagnose. Marcus spent the better part of the afternoon with the SUV, running diagnostics and listening to the engine with the focused attention of someone who could hear machines the way musicians heard music. The problem turned out to be minor, a worn belt that was easy to replace, but Catherine stayed nearby the entire time, watching his work with obvious interest. When he finished, she invited him to join her for iced tea on the main house porch. It was an unusual invitation, crossing the unspoken boundary between employer and employee that had governed their interactions thus far. Marcus hesitated, aware of what it might mean, but his curiosity about Catherine outweighed his caution. The porch was shaded and comfortable, with ceiling fans that moved the hot air without quite cooling it. Catherine had changed from her work clothes into something lighter, a summer dress that made her look younger and more approachable. She poured tea from a crystal pitcher, while Marcus settled into a wicker chair that was more comfortable than anything he had sat in during his years on the road. They talked about the ranch at first, safe territory that allowed them to find their conversational footing. Catherine explained the economics of cattle ranching, the challenges of water management in the desert, the delicate balance between tradition and modernization that she was trying to maintain. Her knowledge was encyclopedic and her passion obvious, and Marcus found himself genuinely engaged in a subject he had never considered before. But the conversation gradually shifted, moving from professional topics to personal ones with the gradual inevitability of water finding its level. Catherine asked about Marcus's years in the military, and he found himself talking about things he usually kept locked away. The friends he had made and lost, the missions that still haunted his dreams, the impossible difficulty of returning to a civilian world that did not understand what he had been through. Catherine listened without judgment, asking questions that showed she was truly paying attention rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. She had a way of creating space for his words, of making him feel like his stories mattered, even when they were painful to tell. In return, she began sharing pieces of her own history. She spoke about her father, a hard man who had built Copper Canyon through sheer force of will and expected nothing less from his only child. She talked about her mother, who had died when Catherine was 12, leaving a void that no amount of success or wealth had ever been able to fill. She told Marcus about the marriage that had failed, a 10-year relationship with a man who had loved her money more than her heart. The divorce had been messy and public, covered by tabloids that seemed to delight in her pain. She had retreated to Copper Canyon afterward, licking her wounds and trying to remember who she was beneath all the roles she had played. Marcus recognized something of himself in her story. They were both refugees from their own lives, people who had achieved things and lost things and ended up in this unexpected place, sitting on this porch drinking tea as the afternoon sun painted the desert gold. He asked why she had stopped for him that morning, why she had fixed his motorcycle instead of simply driving by like everyone else. The question had been burning in him since that first day, and he finally felt like they had built enough trust for him to ask it directly. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the condensation of her glass. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that she was clearly trying to contain. She told him about her brother. Michael had been 4 years older than Catherine, a wild spirit who had chafed against their father's rigid expectations. He had ridden motorcycles, the same kind of Harley that Marcus owned, and he had taught Catherine everything she knew about engines during long summer days in the ranch workshop. Michael had enlisted in the Marines when Catherine was 16, partly to escape their father and partly because he believed in something bigger than himself. He had served 2 tours overseas, letters home full of humor and bravery, and the kind of casual heroism that made Catherine both proud and terrified. He never came back from the 3rd deployment, not in the way that mattered. The man who returned wore her brother's face, but had left some essential part of himself in the desert. He struggled with demons that nobody seemed able to help him fight, falling deeper into darkness despite everything Catherine and her father tried to do. 3 years after his final deployment, Michael took his own life. He did it on his motorcycle, riding into the night and never coming back. They found the bike the next morning, abandoned on a stretch of highway that looked remarkably similar to the place where Catherine had found Marcus. She said she had been driving past that abandoned gas station for years, always looking, always hoping she might find someone who needed the help she had not been able to give her brother. When she saw Marcus's motorcycle, something had clicked into place. She could not save Michael, but maybe she could save someone else. Marcus did not know what to say. The weight of Catherine's confession settled over them both, heavy and sacred and utterly unexpected. He had assumed her kindness came from wealth or guilt or some complicated personal agenda. He had not imagined anything so raw, so human, so heartbreakingly simple. He told her he was sorry. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He understood loss too well to offer false comfort or meaningless platitudes. Catherine nodded, her eyes bright with tears she was refusing to shed. She said she knew he was sorry, just like she knew he understood in ways that most people could not. That was why she had felt safe telling him the truth. That was why she had brought him here. They sat in silence as the sun set, watching the sky transform from blue to orange to deep purple. The space between them felt different now, charged with shared vulnerability and the beginnings of something neither of them had expected to find. Marcus realized that he had been wrong about a lot of things. He had assumed that Catherine's kindness was transactional, that there would be a cost to accepting her help, but her gift had come from grief and hope, from the desperate human need to make meaning out of loss. She had not saved him for her own benefit. She had saved him because saving people was how she kept her brother's memory alive. The weeks that followed brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Marcus and Catherine no longer pretended that their connection was purely professional. They shared meals together more often than not, taking their dinner on her porch rather than in the mess hall, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, building a bridge between their separate solitudes. Marcus found himself looking forward to those evenings with an anticipation that frightened him. He had spent so many years protecting himself from hope, from connection, from the vulnerability of caring about another person. Catherine was dismantling those defenses without even trying, simply by being present and honest and willing to see him as he truly was. The other ranch hands noticed the change, but kept their observations to themselves. Henry, in particular, seemed pleased by the development, his weathered face breaking into knowing smiles whenever he saw Marcus and Catherine together. Whatever concerns he might have had about a homeless biker getting close to his employer had apparently been resolved. One evening, about 2 months after Marcus's arrival, Catherine invited him to ride with her. Not in her SUV, but on horseback, across the ranch property to a place she said was special to her. Marcus had not been on a horse since his childhood, but he agreed without hesitation, willing to follow Catherine anywhere she wanted to lead. They rode through the twilight, the horses picking their way along trails that Catherine clearly knew by heart. The landscape shifted as they climbed into the foothills, scrub brush giving way to scattered pine trees and the distant sound of running water. The destination was a small waterfall, hidden in a canyon that seemed impossibly green against the surrounding desert. A pool had formed at the base of the falls, fed by an underground spring that Catherine said had never run dry in all the years her family had owned this land. It was her sanctuary, she told Marcus, the place she came when she needed to remember what mattered. They dismounted and sat on flat rocks beside the pool, listening to the water and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage, and Marcus felt something in his chest loosen with each breath. Catherine spoke quietly, her voice barely audible above the falling water. She said she had not brought anyone to this place since her brother died. Michael had discovered the waterfall when they were children, and it had been their secret, a refuge from their father's demands and the pressures of the world beyond the ranch boundaries. She turned to face Marcus, and in the starlight he could see that her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. She told him that she had not planned for any of this to happen. When she stopped at that gas station, she was thinking only of Michael, only of the debt she owed to every struggling veteran she encountered. She had not expected to find someone who would become important to her in his own right. Marcus felt his heart beating faster, aware that they were approaching a threshold that would change everything. He had been falling for Catherine slowly, gradually, like the way desert sand shifts beneath constant wind. But he had not allowed himself to name the feeling, afraid that acknowledging it would make it real and therefore vulnerable to loss. She told him that she was scared, scared of caring about someone again, scared of opening herself to the kind of pain that her divorce had caused, scared of wanting something that might not want her back. But she was more scared of never trying, of letting fear dictate the rest of her life, of dying with a heart full of words she never had the courage to speak. She said she was falling in love with him. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and brave, waiting for Marcus to either catch it or let it shatter on the ground. If this story is touching your heart right now, pause for a moment and leave a comment saying, "Everyone deserves a second chance at love." Let me know that you believe in the power of redemption, that you understand how precious it is when two broken people find healing in each other. Marcus did not respond immediately. He sat with her words, feeling their weight, allowing himself to absorb the magnitude of what she had offered. For so long, he had believed that love was something that belonged to his past, a casualty of the war and the wandering and the walls he had built around his wounded heart. But Catherine had seen through those walls from the very beginning. She had recognized something in him that morning at the gas station, something worth saving, worth investing in, worth loving. Her confession was not just an admission of feeling, it was a gift of faith, a declaration that she believed he was capable of receiving love and returning it. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with her softer ones. He told her that he had been lost for a very long time, lost in grief and guilt and the endless motion of a life without direction. But since coming to Copper Canyon, since meeting her, he had started to remember what it felt like to have a destination, what it felt like to want to stay. He told her that he did not know if he was capable of being what she deserved. He was damaged in ways that might never fully heal, haunted by memories that still woke him in the night, uncertain of who he was becoming. But he knew that when he looked at her, he felt something he had given up on ever feeling again. He told her that he was falling in love with her, too. The words felt strange in his mouth, rusty from disuse, but they were true. He had known for weeks, maybe longer, but admitting it out loud made it real in a way that could not be taken back. Catherine squeezed his hand, her tears finally falling freely down her cheeks. But she was smiling, that radiant smile that Marcus had first seen at the abandoned gas station, the smile that had made him believe miracles might still be possible. They sat together beside the waterfall as the night deepened around them, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had been broken by life and were choosing to heal together. The water sang its eternal song, and the stars wheeled overhead, and Marcus felt something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. He felt peace. The months that followed were the happiest Marcus had known since before the war. He continued working at the ranch, his skills increasingly valued by the entire operation, but his role had expanded beyond mere mechanic. Catherine had begun consulting him on decisions about the ranch, treating him as a partner in ways that went far beyond their personal relationship. They did not hide their feelings from the staff, though they maintained professionalism during working hours. The ranch hands accepted the development with the matter-of-fact grace of people who spent their lives close to the land and understood that love, like everything else in nature, followed its own timing. Marcus moved into the main house at Catherine's invitation, into rooms that had once belonged to her brother. She said it felt right, having someone who understood Michael's struggles sleeping in the space he had once occupied. It was not morbid, she insisted. It was healing. A way of honoring his memory while building something new. The nightmares did not disappear entirely, but they became less frequent, less intense. When Marcus woke in the darkness, gasping from visions of sand and blood and lost brothers, Catherine was there beside him. She would hold him without speaking, her presence a steady anchor until the memories loosened their grip and reality reasserted itself. He began to talk about his past more openly, sharing stories he had never told anyone. The friends who had died in his arms, the impossible choices he had been forced to make, the guilt that still gnawed at him for surviving when so many others had not. Catherine listened to everything, never flinching, never judging, creating a space where his wounds could finally begin to close. In return, she shared more of her own story. The loneliness of her childhood, the pressure of being the only heir to her father's expectations, the marriage that had started with hope and ended with betrayal. They learned each other's scars, mapping the geography of pain that had shaped them both, finding that their damaged places somehow fit together like puzzle pieces. Spring arrived with wildflowers that painted the desert in colors Marcus had never imagined possible. Catherine took him riding through meadows of orange poppies and purple lupine, showing him corners of the ranch he had not yet explored. Each ride felt like a discovery, not just of the land, but of each other, of the life they were building together. One morning, Marcus woke before dawn and slipped outside to watch the sunrise. He had developed this habit in the military, those quiet moments when the world was still and anything seemed possible. But the meaning had changed. Now he watched the sun rise over Copper Canyon and felt gratitude instead of wariness, hope instead of resignation. Catherine found him on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in her hands, and settled into the chair beside him. They watched the light transform the landscape together, comfortable in a silence that needed no words to fill it. She told him she had been thinking about the future, about what she wanted her life to look like in 5 years, in 10, in 20. For a long time after her divorce, she had been unable to imagine anything beyond the immediate demands of running the ranch. But lately, she said, she had started dreaming again. Marcus asked what she dreamed about. She turned to face him, her eyes soft in the early light. She said she dreamed about growing old with someone who understood her, about building something together that would outlast them both, about filling the empty rooms of this house with laughter and purpose and maybe, someday, children who would inherit not just the land, but the values she wanted to pass on. She said she dreamed about doing all of that with him. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. A year ago, he had been sleeping on concrete, wondering if he would survive another winter. Now he was sitting beside a woman who wanted to build a life with him, who saw a future where he was present and valued and loved. He told her that he wanted those things too. He said he had stopped believing in second chances long before she found him at that gas station, but she had proven him wrong about everything. She had shown him that redemption was possible, that the past did not have to determine the future, that love could find you even when you had given up looking. He asked her to marry him. The words came out before he had consciously decided to say them, as if his heart had bypassed his cautious mind and spoken directly. They hung in the morning air, sincere and vulnerable and terrifying in their implications. Catherine's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She set down her coffee cup and reached for his face, cradling his jaw in her hands like something precious. She said yes. She said yes, with her voice breaking, and her smile radiant, and her whole heart visible in her eyes. She said yes, like she had been waiting her entire life for someone to ask that question and mean it. They held each other as the sun continued its ascent, 2 people who had been lost and found their way home to each other. The ranch came alive around them, horses whinnying in the pastures and workers beginning their morning routines. But Marcus and Catherine remained in their own world, savoring the magnitude of what they had just decided. The wedding took place at the waterfall, 3 months after Marcus's proposal. It was a small ceremony, attended only by the ranch staff and a few of Catherine's closest friends from her former life. Henry served as Marcus's best man, a role the foreman accepted with gruff pleasure and suspiciously moist eyes. Catherine wore a simple white dress that she had found in a vintage shop in Phoenix, nothing like the elaborate gown from her first wedding. This time, she said, she wanted everything to be real instead of impressive. Marcus wore new clothes that Catherine had helped him select, the first nice things he had owned in years, and he had finally trimmed his beard into something respectable. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, standing beside the pool where Catherine had first confessed her feelings. Marcus spoke about finding hope in unexpected places, about learning to believe in the possibility of happiness after years of darkness. Catherine spoke about her brother, about the grief that had led her to that gas station, about the strange miracle of finding love while trying to honor a lost soul. When they kissed as husband and wife, the small crowd cheered, and the waterfall seemed to sing its approval. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, but he did not try to hide them. These tears were different from the ones he had shed in the dark years. These were tears of gratitude, of joy, of a heart finally learning to open. The reception was held back at the main house, with food prepared by the ranch cook and music played by a local band that Henry had recommended. The staff celebrated with genuine enthusiasm, having watched this love story unfold from its improbable beginning to its beautiful culmination. As evening fell and the dancing wound down, Marcus found himself standing alone on the porch, looking out at the land that had become his home. He thought about the man he had been a year ago, homeless and hopeless, certain that his story was effectively over. He could never have imagined ending up here, married to a woman who loved him, surrounded by people who respected him, building a life that felt meaningful and true. Catherine joined him, slipping her hand into his with the easy intimacy of a woman who knew she belonged there. She asked what he was thinking about. He told her he was thinking about miracles, not the supernatural kind, but the human kind. The miracle of her stopping at that gas station, of her choosing to help a stranger instead of driving past, of her opening her heart to someone the world had written off as worthless. She squeezed his hand and told him he had never been worthless. He had just been waiting for someone to see his value. She said she was grateful every day that she had been the one to find him. They stood together as the stars emerged, the same stars they had watched on that first night when everything began to change. But now they were not two lonely people seeking connection. They were partners, spouses, two halves of a whole that neither had known they were missing. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Marcus and Catherine worked side by side to modernize the ranch, implementing sustainable practices that increased productivity while respecting the land. Marcus's mechanical skills proved invaluable, and he eventually took over the equipment operation entirely when Javier retired. They faced difficulties, of course. Catherine had a miscarriage during their second year of marriage, a loss that plunged them both into grief and tested the strength of their bond. But they weathered the storm together, holding each other through the dark nights and emerging stronger on the other side. When their daughter was born in the 4th year of their marriage, they named her Michelle, a feminine form of Michael. She had Catherine's green eyes and Marcus's stubborn chin, and from her first breath she was loved with an intensity that neither parent had known they were capable of. Marcus often found himself standing in Michelle's nursery at night, watching his daughter sleep and marveling at the path that had led him here. He would think about his brothers who had not made it home, about the years of wandering and despair, about the morning when a stranger had stopped to fix his motorcycle and changed everything. He tried to honor their memory by living well, by being present for his family, by never taking for granted the second chance he had been given. Some days the ghosts still visited, but they no longer had the power to pull him under. He had found something stronger than his pain, something that anchored him to the present, even when the past tried to drag him back. Catherine continued to run the ranch with the same dedication she had always shown, but motherhood had softened some of her harder edges. She smiled more easily now, laughed more freely, allowed herself to enjoy the life she had built instead of constantly pushing toward the next goal. They established a foundation in Michael's name, providing support for veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The work gave meaning to their private grief, transforming it into something productive and healing. Several times a year they hosted retreats at the ranch, bringing together men and women who had served their country and were now fighting to find their way home. Marcus often spoke at these retreats, sharing his own story with a vulnerability that surprised everyone who had known him in his harder days. He talked about the darkness he had walked through, the hopelessness that had nearly consumed him, and the unlikely chain of events that had led to his redemption. His honesty created space for others to be honest in return, and many of the veterans who passed through Copper Canyon credited those conversations with saving their lives. 10 years after Marcus had woken up to find Catherine fixing his motorcycle, they returned to the spot where it all began. The abandoned gas station was still standing, though time and weather had taken their toll. The roof of the service bay had partially collapsed, and the windows were long gone, but the basic structure remained, a monument to an ordinary place where something extraordinary had happened. They had brought Michelle with them, now a bright and curious 9-year-old who loved horses and engines in equal measure. She had grown up hearing the story of how her parents met, and she had begged to see the actual location, to stand in the place where her family's history had begun. Marcus walked through the space that had once been his bedroom, his boots crunching on the same gravel where he had slept all those years ago. The memories were vivid, the cold concrete and the smell of oil and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had given up. but they felt distant now, like scenes from a movie about someone else's life. Catherine stood where she had knelt to work on his carburetor, her eyes bright with emotion. She told Marcus that she had been thinking about this place ever since he proposed the trip. She had been thinking about the version of herself who had stopped here that morning, driven by grief and hope and the desperate need to make meaning from loss. She said she wished she could go back and tell that woman what was coming. Not just the love and the family and the beautiful life, but the healing. The way that helping Marcus would help her too, giving her permission to move forward from her brother's death, to transform her grief into something generative instead of destructive. Marcus put his arm around her shoulder and pulled her close. He told her he wished he could do the same thing, that he could somehow communicate to his past self that everything was going to be okay. But maybe that was the point, he said. Maybe you had to walk through the darkness without knowing what waited on the other side. Maybe faith meant putting one foot in front of the other even when you could not see the path. Michelle tugged at Catherine's hand, asking to see exactly where her father's motorcycle had been parked. They walked together to the spot, and Marcus described that morning in detail, the mist hanging low, the surprise of seeing a beautiful woman crouched beside his bike, the confusion and suspicion, and then, gradually, the hope. His daughter listened with rapt attention, her face serious in the way of children who understand they are hearing something important. When he finished, she asked if he had known right away that Catherine was special. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. He said he had known from the first moment that she was different. Not just because she had stopped to help when everyone else would have driven past, but because of something in her eyes. A quality of seeing that made him feel visible for the first time in years. He said he had not known they would fall in love, that they would build a life together, that they would someday stand in this very spot with a daughter who was proof of their second chance. But he had known somehow that meeting her was significant, that the universe, or fate, or whatever you wanted to call it, had arranged for their paths to cross for a reason. Michelle nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the trust of a child who had grown up surrounded by love. Then she asked if they could get ice cream on the way home, and the solemnity broke into laughter as the family returned to their vehicle. They drove away from the abandoned gas station, leaving it to continue its slow decay into the desert. But the story that had begun there would continue, would grow, would ripple outward in ways that none of them could predict. Every veteran who found hope at the Copper Canyon Retreat Center, every child who would grow up learning about courage and second chances, every person whose life was touched by the foundation they had created, all of it traced back to that single morning when a grieving woman decided to stop for a stranger. Marcus held Catherine's hand as they drove, Michelle chattering happily in the back seat about horses and school and the book she was reading. The Arizona landscape rolled past the windows, beautiful and harsh and full of hidden possibilities. He thought about his brothers who had not made it home, and he silently promised them that he would keep living fully, keep honoring their sacrifice by refusing to waste the life they had not been given. He thought about Catherine's brother Michael, whose death had set in motion the chain of events that saved Marcus's own life, and he felt a gratitude too large for words. Most of all, he thought about the woman beside him, the woman who had seen him at his lowest and chosen to believe he could become something more. Catherine had not just fixed his motorcycle that morning. She had fixed something in him that he had thought was permanently broken. She had restored his faith in humanity, in love, in the possibility of redemption. As they crossed onto Copper Canyon land, the familiar fences and pastures coming into view, Marcus felt the same peace he had experienced on their wedding day. This was his home now. These people were his family, and the life he was living was the one he was always meant to find. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as they pulled up to the house, that beautiful house that had once seemed like an impossible dream. Henry was waiting on the porch, ready to help unload the car, his weathered face creased into the smile that had become so familiar over the years. Marcus stepped out of the vehicle and took a deep breath of desert air, filling his lungs with the scent of sage and possibility. He was home. After all the wandering, all the loss, all the darkness, he had finally found his way home. And it had all started with a woman who stopped to help a stranger, who fixed a motorcycle and offered a meal and changed the entire trajectory of a broken man's life. That was the real miracle Marcus knew. Not the ranch or the marriage or even his beautiful daughter. The miracle was the choice Catherine had made that morning, the decision to see someone else's pain and respond with compassion. If you watched until this moment, it is because this story touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and know who truly loves the stories on this channel." Your presence here means more than you know. Give this video a like if you believe in second chances, if you believe that love can find us even in our darkest moments. Share it with someone who needs to hear that hope is always possible, that redemption is always within reach, that the right person can appear when we least expect them and change everything. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Join this community of people who believe in the power of human kindness, in the courage to help strangers, in the miracles that happen when we choose compassion over indifference. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places. Sometimes, healing comes from the hands of someone we have never met. And sometimes, waking up to find a stranger fixing your motorcycle is the first moment of the rest of your life. Marcus Cole knew that now. He had lived it, breathed it, built an entire existence on the foundation of that single morning. And every day when he woke beside the woman who had saved him, he remembered that everyone deserves a second chance at love. Everyone. Even a homeless biker sleeping in an abandoned gas station. Even you.